I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities of Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a wealth of topics pertaining to modern music, including artist deep dives and monthly and annual new music wrap-ups. Today, Tom and I are going to talk about the Beatles.
Yes.
And it's a subject, Tom, that we've been waiting years.
We have. We've really been talking about this for years. Like, how are we going to address the Beatles someday?
And before we answer that question, you guys can help support Velocities of Music. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcasting device to automatically get our latest podcast episode sent to your device each week. Also, we don't want your money. We also don't want to introduce ads to our podcast just yet. Right now, all we want from you guys is for you to share Velocities of Music with your family or friends whom you think would benefit from joining in on the music discussion we try to create here each week. So the Beatles.
Yes.
How do we talk about the Beatles, Tom?
Where's a good entry point for discussing this group?
And what is this podcast going to be? Is it going to be like, are we just going to talk about their impact and their history? Are we going to give like a historical context of everything that they did?
I mean, I think that all that information's already out there. You know, the thing about talking about the Beatles...
What about their impact,
in 2016? Tom? Well, that's the thing. Everything that could be said about their impact, about their history, has probably already been said. But, you know, maybe it's not all in one place. Maybe, you know, it's a little bit biased or maybe even too objective in some points, you know. I like for people to be able to draw their own conclusions.
Everyone has heard of the Beatles, though.
Yeah.
We can make that assumption.
Yeah, I think so.
Everyone's heard of the Beatles. Now, whether or not you personally listen and love the Beatles is up to, you know, your own opinions and practices to decide. However, you know, just to be, you know, perfectly honest, like Tom and I are huge Beatles fans.
Yes.
And we've loved the Beatles. Tom, you actually loved the Beatles before I did.
I think I loved the Beatles before I have like conscious memory. Honestly,
and that's
I just
impressive.
grew up listening to it. It was always around.
And I made a conscious decision to listen to the Beatles albums and then fell in love with them.
That's a good point, because while I did grow up with the Beatles around, there is a difference in the way that you're listening to music when you're like 4 years old, right? You know, and that through elementary school. I mean, it wasn't probably until I was maybe 13 in middle school that I actually consciously was like, you know what? Which Beatles songs are on this Beatles album?
Yeah.
I'm going to put it on and listen to it all the way through. Yep. That was kind of a rediscovery for me, and another build in my appreciation for them. So I guess, you know, there's kind of different listening phases and approaches to the Beatles, at least in my life. A little Beatles reference, but they're all over the place, man. It's going to be impossible not to make them. But
you were actually my first introduction to the Beatles.
Okay.
Outside of just like hearing them in passing, like actually hanging out with you, and when we were in high school and hanging out, just like playing Mario Golf or something. I remember you putting Beatles albums on, as long as Modest Mouse as well. Yeah, and
yeah, you're right. Those were my golf video game albums.
Yeah, they were. Tiger Woods. Yeah, we used to play that and listen to the Beatles. But I never really got into them. I was 19 years old when I got into them, and I remember this very specifically because I made a conscious decision to actually go through their works and learn all the Beatles albums and their music and what it meant. And I actually approached it from the new Beatles first and then started getting into the old Beatles later. But I did throughout like I went through like a period of like 2 or 3 months where I was just obsessed with the Beatles. And it was in January, it would have been January 2006 when this happened.
Okay. Wow, 10 years ago this month.
Yeah. And the Beatles, because that was the time period in which I got into it, specifically that time of year, January, just for you guys who are listening to us that don't live in Iowa, January in Iowa is an incredibly introverted time because it is too cold to be outdoors. You cannot go outdoors for extended periods of time. So you're just essentially locked inside buildings. And
it's not like Colorado where there's actually stuff to do outdoors when it's cold.
No, there's nothing to do. There's nothing to do really ever in Iowa, but especially in January, you're essentially locked inside. And you know, at the time, you know, I was in college, so I was thinking critically. I was being forced to think critically about a lot of things. So it naturally made sense. So to dive into a musical body of work and then really go into it. The other thing is that when you're locked inside for that extended period of time, and often the weather is like cloudy and very gloomy, you know, it affects your mood.
Oh, definitely. You get the seasonal effect, whatever it's called. Yeah, I definitely get that.
Sad seasonal affective disorder. Oh, I am perfectly susceptible to that. I notice it every year.
Yeah.
But in January, you know, it's prevalent around here.
Definitely.
It's something that a lot of people experience. The Beatles' music is so naturally optimistic and so naturally life-giving that when I listen to the Beatles, especially in the mornings, like when I'm getting ready, even today, it makes my day better.
Oh yeah,
and it's like it just breathes life throughout me, and like I'm in a better mood. I'm more effective at my job and in my relationships.
And so what more perfect timing could there have been for the Beatles music to hit Spotify?
Exactly.
like right in the last week of December.
It's like they also acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And I don't know the particulars of why now is the time that they
Probably
decided.
some legal crap.
But I'm thankful that all the Beatles music is on Spotify, because now you have a whole generation of music listeners who get their music primarily through Spotify, who now have access to the Beatles. Because I remember like back in the day when I was going in 2006, when I was trying to get all the Beatles albums, I literally couldn't get their second record with the Beatles. I couldn't get it. I couldn't find it anywhere, and I could have ordered it. I think eBay was in its prime then, and I could have ordered it on eBay, but it was like $50, and I was a broke college kid, and there's no way I could do that.
No way you're spending $50 on a CD.
So thankfully I didn't pirate music back then, but I was just of this mindset that that album didn't exist. So I started off going through all the newer it's the 60s. Going through the Beatles' second half of their discography, essentially from Revolver on, first, and then coming back and listening to the early records. And I really fell in, and by the end of the 3 albums, or those 3 months, I've had fallen in love with their entire discography, which was really something special. So that is a very verbose way of describing how I'd propose, Tom, we structure this as an artist deep dive.
Boom.
2 parts.
2 parts.
2 parts. In this podcast, the podcast that you guys are listening to right now, I say, Tom, we dive into early Beatles.
Early Beatles.
Early Beatles. Start off with their first album that was released, Please Please Me, and go through, what do you think the appropriate middle ground should be? What album should we cut it off on?
After diving into their music, rewatching the Beatles anthology, getting a sense of their history, there's actually a few different places that I could see it making sense. I could understand arguments for it being between Help and Rubber Soul, between Rubber Soul and Revolver, and between Revolver and Sgt. Pepper.
Okay.
I think, all of those places would make sense. I don't think there's a wrong pick. For the sake of what we're doing, I think between Rubber Soul and Revolver makes the most sense.
Okay. So we'll take this podcast up until Revolver, and then talk about Revolver through Let It Be in our next podcast, which you guys will hear next week. But before we get started, Tom, what do you want this podcast to be? This is a tough one, because this is such, like, the Beatles mean so much to me. Just in talking about the Beatles, I get so excited that I have a ton of opinions on each of their albums and stuff, and so as we go through this is all going to be very opinion based, right? And I guess I want to give the disclaimer that I know that my opinion might be completely wrong, or you guys might not agree with my opinion at all.
Well, but that's always going to be the case. I think with the Beatles, it just stirs more controversy because there's naturally a larger group of people out there who have knowledge and familiarity with the Beatles, because they're arguably the biggest band of all time. Now, what I want to do is, go through their discography, address where changes took place in their sound, because I think those are things that are maybe harder to identify. People know that they love the Beatles music, but, really, where does their greatness come from?
How does their sound evolve over time, at each of their releases? As you were saying earlier, like, we're not going to be able to say things that haven't been said about the Beatles. Like, there's absolutely no way in 2016 we're going to be able to accomplish anything on that front. Also, historically, like, there are so many books and documentaries and historical recollections of the Beatles and their accomplishments that there's nothing we're going to be able to provide you guys.
I'm pretty sure, I think it's somewhere in the UK maybe, but some university, you can get a degree in Beatles history. That's a thing.
That's a thing?
Yeah.
Why are we still in Iowa? Like, why aren't we both there doing
getting
that?
those degrees. Well, like, but that's, that just goes to show, I mean, they've had such an impact on popular culture, not just music, not just art, but popular culture over the, hardly a decade that they were really a functioning band, that it's an insane statement to make. And a lot of people argue that they are the greatest band of all time. Yeah. I'm in that boat. I'm on that bandwagon, but I want to provide some context as to why. Not that I'm trying to convince anyone. I'm not trying to change anyone's mind here. I just want to convey why people think that, because there are reasons out there, but I don't think that really people are all that clear in arguing and explaining it.
So, Tom, to sum this up, if we're not providing insight on the impact of the Beatles, and we're not providing a solid historical context. Obviously, there's going to be historical references to set up the conversation, but if we're not providing a good source of record as to the Beatles and their history, why would people listen to this podcast?
Well, Jake, I mean, the whole purpose of this podcast is talking about our opinions, the way that we think through music. And honestly, throughout the years, we've had people asking us all the time to give our thoughts on the Beatles, because really when it comes down to it, it is an important starting point to understanding our musical experience and our points of view on music as a whole. The Beatles are kind of a starting point for us. Right. So I think it's fair to everyone to make clear what our thoughts on the Beatles are, provide our insight, because everyone's experience is going to be different. Even if everyone's already talked this band to death and maybe even have an understanding of their music, I still want to make sure we can share what are our favorites, what are our highlights, what maybe don't we like about them, because it's going to differ for everyone.
Absolutely, and I want that to generate music discussion with all you guys out there listening. The Beatles are such a fascinating subject. Their music is just so impactful that discussing album to album, how they created the listening experience and the legendary music that they did, and how that impacted you. Like, I'm totally interested in that, and I'm really excited about that conversation.
Yeah, me as well. So kicking it off here, let's take a look at timeline, because we mentioned, Jake, that we're going to stop at Rubber Soul for the sake of this podcast, moving into the later years. But what's funny is, really, that means we're only covering 3 years of the band's career where they were releasing albums, 1963, 1964, and 1965.
I just realized that, and that's mind-blowing.
But they put out such a crazy output of music during that time. I mean, so many, I think it was 2 albums a year for each of those years.
That's 6
right?
albums,
yeah, in 3 years. And I think that the context leading up to that is important. Jake, as you mentioned, we're not historians. We're not going to get into the weeds of how these kids met when they were kids. John, Paul, George, and Ringo, how that all came to be.
Now, Tom, real quick, what would you recommend resources people seek out if they wanted that level of historical context?
I would say watch the Beatles anthology. It's a great documentary. I think it's a little unevenly weighted, but it gives much more detail on their early years.
On YouTube, you can also get The Long and Winding Road. Yeah, I mean, you can watch that, which it's a little bit. It's not as I personally prefer the anthology. To The Long and Winding Road, but
But honestly, I mean, even while this sounds like a cop out, even just reading Wikipedia pages, you can at least gain a starting kind of understanding of. There's always little nuggets to pull from.
And
stuff
if you're
like
very extreme, you can take that course we were talking about earlier.
Right, you can get a degree in it. Probably someone that has that degree is going to listen to this and just demolish us, Jake.
I would
just
love that.
Just own it. Like,
I would absolutely enjoy that.
Teach me. Tell me what you know.
PhD in the Beatles.
Right, no kidding.
So what if their name was Robert? They were Dr. Robert. Get a degree in the Beatles.
Oh my God. I mean, you have to at that point.
Yeah. They'd have to legally change their name to Robert.
Right. You are all Dr. Roberts now. And anyway, so as I mentioned, their actual album output, we're covering 1963 to 1965. What I think is important to discuss, 2 things. First off, what happened before that led up to it? Not getting too specific, but I think a couple important things to note is, they started playing in the late 50s. They started really seriously touring and playing professionally in the early 60s, kind of 1960 to 1962. And one thing that I think people commonly overlook when it comes to the Beatles, because, they know their recordings, but obviously, Jake, we weren't around back then to see what was going on. No, believe it or not, neither of us were around in the 60s. So I think people overlook how freaking hardworking they were in their early days.
Right.
And that is key. They didn't just come out of nowhere and get discovered and become, like a studio label manufactured boy band like you get sometimes in the 90s and 2000s now. They just worked their asses off,
right.
legitimately. They had stints in Hamburg, Germany, where they were playing every freaking night. And that gave them the opportunity to get to know how to play with each other. Now, back then in those days, they did, have a different drummer, Pete Best. It was before Ringo had officially joined the band. But Ringo and his group, Rory and the Hurricanes, were actually in Hamburg at the time as well for some of that. Ringo would jam with them, and they always kind of felt like they had a good vibe with Ringo. So in 1963, when they did go to play or to record Please Please Me, then Ringo ended up joining them for that.
And that's such a crucial lineup change. It's interesting because, they went away from Pete and he was the best.
He was Mr. Best.
Yeah.
Dr. Best, if he has a PhD. I don't know if he does. But one thing I looked up in advance of preparing this, Jake, that I think is important is in 1963, and I just counted this, I couldn't find a total for this, so I went and counted this manually. In 1963, the Beatles performed almost 250 concerts. Just think about that for a second. Some of those were multiple shows in a day in different cities. Like, they were working their asses off. And that amount of concerts, I'm pretty sure 1964 and 1962, the years surrounding that, they played almost as many. But they were touring constantly, developing a following. And, it's not like they were this band that just shot to stardom overnight. They worked for it.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's overlooked.
Right. And doing those shows is what made them click as musicians, because there's nothing that can replace just the perseverance and just the practice that you go through when you're playing music with the same people for that long. It's what enabled them to hammer out their entire first album, Please Please Me, in one day's worth of recording sessions, because these are the songs that they'd been touring with already for a couple years.
It also forced them to practice at a level that they became very, very good musicians. And
right.
You can pick out, especially in the early albums, you can notice it on Please Please Me and with the Beatles, how like none of the in any individual instrumental part is that advanced.
No.
But they are so tight and so
yes.
well performed, and that lays the foundation for all of the great things instrumentally that they're going to do later on
right.
in their later years.
And while I think that their later years is what establishes and solidifies their legacy and their influence, they couldn't have done that with their later years if they hadn't gotten the hardcore following that they obtained during their early years. So I think it's important to look at how they actually achieved that, because it's easy in the 2000s now to look back at their early albums like Please Please Me and With the Beatles and so on and think, well, what really made them different? Because at first listen, it doesn't necessarily sound all that special, but you have to take into account context. And there are some key things that they had. Now, one thing I mentioned is their work ethic and just how much they practiced together, how much they played. I don't think that, there were other bands doing that at the time, but maybe they just weren't as naturally talented. But there are some other key things that contribute for me as well. First off, they're more well-rounded. They're just a more well-rounded group. Everyone contributes. It's not like where they have one band leader and then a backing band, which was very common back then.
Right.
I mentioned Rory and the Hurricanes, the band Ringo was in. Well, just from the name right there, it's always something and the something, right? Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Now, I'm a hardcore Buddy Holly fan. I love Buddy Holly, but obviously it's about Buddy Holly. It's not, I can't say offhand that I know the names of the Crickets,
right.
But everyone knows the names of all four Beatles because they contributed. Jiminy Cricket. He's the leader of the Crickets aside from Buddy Holly, King Cricket. But with the Beatles, they were all very, they all contributed their own part to the band. Aside from that, you had four capable songwriters. While Ringo didn't necessarily, really form his songwriting talent until kind of close to when the Beatles were done. He still contributed a couple tracks, but mainly, John, Paul, and George. And George, while he didn't have the quantity of songs that Lennon and McCartney did, I think that George was all about quality. I mean, his songs were great, and he was contributing. His first song on the Beatles discography was "Don't Bother Me" on With the Beatles. So their second album, right away in 1963, he's writing some good tracks, and that's a good one. Maybe there were some albums that he didn't have any tracks on, and for the most part, maybe he only had anywhere from like 1 to 3 or 4 tracks on an album, aside from the White Album, which is monstrous. But those gems make a difference, and especially just mixing it up. They also had 4 capable vocalists. What other bands at that time were swapping vocal duties as heavily as the Beatles were?
Right.
George, for the most part, sang the songs that he wrote, but he also sang some other ones. They had him sing "Roll Over Beethoven," which is the Chuck Berry cover. They even had him sing "Happy Just to Dance with You" from Hard Day's Night, which is entirely composed by Lennon McCartney. But Lennon McCartney still had George sing that one song. They still had Ringo sing some tracks, like, later Yellow Submarine, but in their early days, Boys, Honey Don't. They all kind of sing lead together on like "I Want to Be Your Man," but you can hear Ringo's voice really sticking out.
And they all participate in harmonies.
Oh, their harmonies were killer. They could harmonize like mad.
And throughout the Beatles discography, I think that the harmonies are one thing that you have to watch. There's 2 things to me that you have to watch evolve over time. And one is the harmonies, from Please Me to Abbey Road, their last recorded record. You can hear the harmonies evolve over time, starting with like the songs on Please Me, and I think that they reached their ultimate point with the song Because on Abbey Road.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the lyrics, and watching how the lyrics, especially in this podcast, Tom, when we're talking about the Beatles' early years, hearing how the lyrics changed album to album is, I think, very important, because it sheds light on how the Beatles were evolving as a band, and what their interests were and where their songwriting was going. You can almost predict, if you read the Beatles, and maybe this is just me and my super fandom going a little nuts, but when I listen to the Beatles, I can almost pick out new influences that are starting to arise, and you can almost use that as a predictor of where they were going to go next, if I were to just assume that I hadn't already heard those records.
And I think that you hit the nail on the head there, Jake. There are a few things that we really need to make sure that we are addressing from album to album, what's changing. That's going to be harmonies and lyrics, as well as songwriting, production, and general instrumentation, when they started to incorporate other instrumentals into the songs. So, I think that we've given up front kind of a good starting point as to what made the Beatles different. So let's actually just dive into their albums, now that we've talked through some of that initial like history and setup.
So before we do that,
okay,
American or UK?
Oh, it's got to be UK all the way.
It has to be.
It has to be. All the American releases were really just compilations, and to me, they just kind of confuse things. Not that they were necessarily bad, but they were very, very rehashed.
Right. And also, they released a lot of singles. A lot of times, their singles that they released were A-side tracks that just never never put on an album, which is a very unique thing in this day and age.
Yeah.
How are we going to incorporate their use of singles?
I think that we can address them as they come, but there is one thing that I want to summarize about their use of singles. And this, to me, it particularly comes into play when you get to like 1965, 1966, when they're starting to release songs like We Can Work It Out, Rain, Day Tripper, Paperback Writer, stuff like that. Is they really, to me, use the singles as a way to experiment outside of the context of an album.
Right.
And how brilliant is that when you can write just an individual song that lets you take some creative and artistic freedom and do things that you wouldn't necessarily want to do on an album, because at that point in time, it's kind of risky. People haven't been opened up to some of those weird, quote-unquote, recording techniques and songwriting styles. So, to be able to do it just for a song and not have to worry about it conflicting with other tracks on an album, I think that really helped them to expand. And actually even more later, getting ahead of ourselves, but I think we'll see Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever play a key role in that.
So their first record is Please Please Me.
And Please Please Me as a starting point, really strong. While it's not one of my more favorite Beatles records, you can listen to it all the way through, and it's strong. How they kind of got to where they are with Please Please Me, I mentioned that they recorded the entire album in one day, and really the context leading to that is, as I mentioned, the early 60s, they were touring nonstop. They became one of the premier bands in their area, and that, because of that, you get out there enough, you're going to catch the eye of people who can make things happen for you. So they got into the studio, and they were really just kind of told to, record the songs that they had, 6 of which were covers. And actually, I think it's funny because their first, second, and fourth albums, Please Please Me with the Beatles and Beatles for Sale, each have 6 covers on them. And then the rest are originals from the band. And of course, on Please Please Me, this was before George and Ringo were writing tracks, so all the originals are Lennon and McCartney. But I think that addressing the covers that they choose is really important as well, because which ones they choose for these albums that have covers in their early days really does end up affecting the sound.
And Tom, you mentioning a couple times now that they recorded this in one day, and you can really hear that when you listen to this record. There is not a lot of studio effects or production techniques going on at all. It sounds like a live recording, honestly.
There really wasn't much of that at all back then, That was just the way it was. Studios were meant for capturing live performances. They weren't meant for manipulation and trickery or anything like that. It's a place where you go, you play live, and you play the songs over and over again until you get a take that's good. You think about in 1963, I mentioned them doing like over 200 shows and releasing 2 albums. And really, it's because they were so good at performing. And that's also just the way that recording worked back then, is it was just meant to capture those live performances.
And the performances that were captured in Please Please Me to me is more of a snapshot of where the Beatles were in those early days. And it sounds like that too. And that's what I think, it has this almost like visceral energy that no other Beatles record in the early days captures in such a way that Please Please Me does. The album, it's 32 minutes long. And as you said, Tom, there's 6 covers on it. This thing flies by. The average track length on this record is like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And a lot of these songs are very similarly structured. The Beatles are very, very simple. They're a very simple band back then. They're trying to emulate the style of the time, which is why they were doing so many covers. And it was all about the live show. And you have your simple verse, chorus, pop structure format, which I've now come to hate in modern music, but no one does it better than the Beatles. And they still were able to do it and capture such an energy because it was built on that live performance. They had to have the energy to sell it.
Yeah, and they perform it so well, and there's still some good variety in here in styles. And once again, one thing that they do to make it not so one-dimensional is switch up the vocalists. You got Ringo singing Boys, and I like Ringo's voice for the songs that they choose to have him sing, because Ringo doesn't have a pretty voice, but he's a very capable vocalist. He can sing on pitch, he can sing with energy, and he sings with charisma.
And his voice is noticeably deeper than the other 3.
Yes, and it provides variety. I would actually say, so for me, I don't know if it's this way for you, Jake, this applies to really all the Beatles' early days until, probably like Sgt. Pepper, maybe even through White Album. But in their early stuff, I have much harder time telling George and John's voices apart. I think that Paul's and Ringo's stand out like mad, right? But John and George sound a little bit more similar. But
I would totally agree with
that. But still, where George sings, I think that they really pick the right songs to have him sing.
Now, we talked about just the inherent lack of production based on how they recorded this record, and the compounded effect of just the energy that they captured, because this really is just a snapshot of what the Beatles were in 1963. But in addition, you hear a lot of their early harmonies here. They're not perfect on this record, and I think that's what gives it such a charm. We talk about a lot of times when Tom and I are evaluating an album, we talk about the album's inherent X factor, and a lot of times X factor is due to imperfections. And Please Please Me certainly has that. The performances aren't always as tight. Now, I mentioned earlier that they were super tight in that they had been playing these songs live, and yes, contextually speaking, when you think about the fact that they recorded this album in a day, they obviously played very tight. But from a recording standpoint, there's tons of little imperfections in there
Yeah.
in the instrumentation. You can especially notice it in Ringo's drumming, but also in the vocal harmonies. It is not perfect. There are some off-key moments in here, and it's okay. It gives them this juvenile charm, and it's perfect for a debut album.
Right. And one track that I think we have to highlight is the closing track, Twist and Shout.
Oh my gosh.
That performance, it was kind of a first take thing. They've been recording all day. It was the last song of the day that they recorded. I think they said it was like 10 p.m. or something. And John's voice was just gone. And he was like, I've got one chance to do this. Let's just do it. And he just blew his voice out on that track. And it's perfect. It's one of the covers on the album, but the Beatles version of Twist and Shout is the epitomal version of Twist and Shout.
Yeah,
it's
and
the one everyone knows.
And it's because of John's vocal performance that sells it, and they made it their own. So, that's why I really like a lot of Beatles covers, is because they make the songs their own. They really sell them well. Notable tracks on this record: Misery, kind of a ballad-esque kind of pop. It's a more poppy tune. I mean, these are all pop tunes, but that one is super poppy to me.
Well, especially coming after I Saw Her Standing There, the opening track, which is a driving rock song. It really is.
The kind of guy who never used to cry. The world is treating me bad. Misery.
Another cover on the album, which is one of my favorite tracks on the album, is track 4, Chains. Some others, Love Me Do. It's a big single from the album. Another P.S. I Love You.
Yep. Please Please Me and Love Me Do, kind of the early singles, really helped to get them notoriety and fame around the UK, which, was kind of surprising to them. And it's actually something that they kicked against their record label and their producers on. George Martin was trying to shop around for songs for them to perform, to be hits, and the Beatles were stubborn. And they said, no, we got to do our own stuff. I mean, obviously they're still doing covers, but in terms of the singles that they're releasing, to them, that was what they needed to do to keep their integrity, was write their own hit singles.
One other cover that I think adds a lot of depth to this record is track 5 on side 2, which is A Taste of Honey, a cover. That song, when you hear it, you have that really stark guitar line, but like the vocals, they do a lot of dynamic contrast with the vocals, and it's a very impactful song in that it sounds nothing like any other track on the album. And that really shows that the Beatles, there was more to the Beatles than just being this, this term probably didn't apply at the time, but a teeny bopper band,
right?
That was this very commercial product. Like there was something else there, so they introduced this level of intrigue with that cover and including that cover on this record, which I think is kind of brilliant.
I feel upon my lips again a taste of honey, tasting much sweeter than wine.
The lyrics on this record, on Please Please Me, pretty much all revolve around love.
Relationships.
And really that cheesy, juvenile, falling in love with a girl. And that's the general theme of this record, and it's reflected in the title. It's very superficial love, and we see that early in the early Beatles work. But watching how the lyrics evolve, it's very key to note that this is their starting point.
And they still, everyone was singing about relationships back then. That was what the music was. It was what people were into. And I will give the Beatles credit, before they move on from that subject, they milk it for all it is worth.
They do.
And they do everything they can to make that topic interesting, and John Lennon was doing that with Please Please Me. He was inspired by a Roy Orbison tune that features Roy Orbison singing Please Hear My Please, little wordplay, and he basically just took that concept and said, well, please please me, there's two different uses of the word please right next to each other. And so they're trying to find little tricks like that even right away, but they get more creative with it as we move on to subsequent albums.
Moving on from their first record, Please Please Me, later in 1963, November of 1963, the Beatles released their second album titled With the Beatles. And this album, like I said earlier, extremely hard for me to get. If there is one Beatles record, Tom, that I am the least familiar with, it is With the Beatles.
Yeah.
Now, I've listened to it extensively still, but it just, I've probably listened to every other Beatles record well over 100 times, and this one maybe only, 35.
Yeah, right. I'm kind of in the same boat as you, Jake, and we've been listening the crap out of the Beatles for the last couple weeks preparing for this, and at that point, when we started this, With the Beatles was definitely the album of theirs I was the least familiar with, and most of the reason for that is just because I don't come back to it much because it's easily one of my least favorites.
Sure.
Especially in their early days, I prefer the albums surrounding it, Please Please Me and Hard Day's Night. This one, as I've listened to it, it's grown on me more, I will say.
Right.
I still really like it, but the biggest thing for me is I just think this has some of their least strong covers, is actually what brings it down a little bit for me.
That's a really good point. There's 6 covers on this album.
And I really like Roll Over Beethoven, and I like Money. I don't think that Devil in Her Heart is all that strong. I like that they had George sing that one. I think it brings some variety, but as its own track, it's not great. Actually, Please Mr. Postman is all right. Till There Was You, I like the track all right, but it's just a little slow. It's an old show tune from the Music Man. So I like that musical, but it's I don't know. It's a little lackluster for me.
There were birds in the sky, but I never saw them winging. No, I never saw them at all till there was you.
I think one thing that we have to note with the Beatles is this record is the natural evolution of Please Please Me. And when we our first artist deep dive, when we talked about Led Zeppelin, Tom, and we were talking about how Led Zeppelin 1 to Led Zeppelin 2 is more of a perfected version of Led Zeppelin 1. This is kind of an earlier case of that, because With the Beatles is a more perfected version of Please Please Me. They spent much more time in the studio. This wasn't recorded in just one day, and you can notice it if you're listening for that. The production techniques used were much more expansive, and therefore the sound is tighter. You can hear the harmonies are more on key because they spent more time preparing them. The song structures are a bit more, especially on the original tracks, a bit more intense as they experiment with adding intros and outros to some of their tracks.
I totally agree with that. I just find overall the songwriting isn't quite as engaging for me on this one. I do love the opening track, It Won't Be Long.
Right.
So hard hitting right from the get-go, especially with those alternating harmonized yas in the chorus.
Yep. That song and I Want to Be Your Man, track 4 on side 2, really hard hitting, show the Beatles wanted to be a rock and roll band and wanted to push the envelope of what rock and roll music was in the early 60s. And so I think that those are pretty key hits.
This also has the first George Harrison pen tune, which is Don't Bother Me, which is actually a highlight for me. And actually, to me, I think that George is really starting to expand their lyricism.
Absolutely.
Don't Bother Me is still kind of based on relationship, but it's, you don't necessarily just get that from the title. You have to listen to it, and it's kind of a play where, Don't Bother Me, and the reason still kind of has to do with relationship stuff, but he makes it a little more about himself.
But
I think that's a great tune.
You're starting to see that evolution in the lyrics. Now, where Lennon and McCartney, all of their songs are mostly about love, and still about that trivial, juvenile falling in love with a girl in that initial attraction stage of a relationship. You haven't seen them start to evolve yet. So you're seeing Harrison start to influence the direction of the Beatles, which even this early on is one of the most interesting subjects of dissecting the Beatles and how they write music.
Now, there's one thing I got to point out about this album, Jake.
Okay.
And that is the fifth track, Little Child. I do not think it is ever acceptable to refer to a female love interest as little child in a song. It creeps me out, man. And you could argue the same thing for Baby, but man, little child, won't you dance with me? It just makes me feel uneasy.
Makes you a little uncomfortable.
I know it's a different time and a different culture, but man, it just gives me the heebie-jeebies. And this is not the last time that the Beatles do it. And we hear it through rock music all the time. I always think of like Lynyrd Skynyrd, what's your name, little girl? What's your name? It's just creepy. I just picture a dude like sitting in an unmarked van, like trying to, I don't know. I don't dig that. That song always gives me the willies.
That's how they're trying to engage with you, Tom. They're creeping you out,
No.
which brings you closer to the music and lets you listen to it in a different light.
I understand it's a different time, but I just have to get that out of there. I have to get it out of my system.
Little child, little child, little child, won't you dance with me? I'm so sad and lonely. Baby, take a chance with me.
Tom, notable tracks from With the Beatles?
For me, It Won't Be Long is a great one. I do really like All My Loving. That was a classic one of their early days, which really, in essence, I don't think that they're doing a whole lot different with that track at this point. I just think it's a well-written melody, good chord progression, just generally enjoyable tune.
And then while I'm away, I'll ride home every day, and I'll send all my loving to you.
Also in that is Don't Bother Me, the Harrison track you mentioned, Tom.
Yeah.
Roll Over Beethoven, the cover that starts off side 2, and then I Want to Be Your Man. Now, a song that I always associate with this time period of the Beatles that's not on this record is I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Yeah.
Which was released as a single, and I think came out of this recording session.
Yeah.
And that is one of the early Beatles. It's one of the primary tracks that I think come to people's minds when you think about early Beatles songs. Is I Want to Hold Your Hand, and so it's to me noteworthy to acknowledge that song existed in the context of With the Beatles because it really embodied the sound of With the Beatles and the production techniques, the evolution of the lyrics, the evolution of the vocal harmonies, and yet still it's not included on the album. So it's almost like With the Beatles sent a representative track to this like Congress of Beatles songs that don't appear on albums.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something I think you'll understand. When I say that something, I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand.
I also want to say I think that I Want to Hold Your Hand is a great highlight of Ringo's drumming ability.
That's a very good point.
That people give Ringo crap, and after diving back into their early stuff, I actually think he was more impressive on their early stuff than their later stuff. I don't know if it's maybe he just couldn't keep up as much with how the sound was changing later on. I still think he was good,
right.
But man, in those early albums, like he's really hauling ass. He's working his butt off, and I have nothing but respect. I think that the drum parts he writes complements what's going on with the rest of the instrumentals.
Yep, that's his role.
I think he kills it.
Yeah, that's his role, is to provide that foundation, and he just does it perfectly.
All right, we're moving on to 1964, as With the Beatles came out in late 1963. Now we're in 1964. The Beatles take their first trip to America, where they didn't really even know that they were popular. They knew that they had a hit record in America, and that's why they decided to go over there. But they got to America with this just huge reception, people crowding the airport. They were instant celebrities, and they didn't even really know that they had that kind of acclaim. So, going into 1964, trying to now please fans on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, they come out with A Hard Day's Night, their first album released in 1964, in the middle of 1964, and of course it was accompanied by a film too. Now this is where I think we start to get an important difference between them and other artists of the time.
Yep.
Their film presence.
Right.
Hard Day's Night was a goofy ass film.
Right.
It was full of British humor.
It was a mock documentary.
Right.
I actually haven't seen it.
Oh, it's funny. It's drier than some of their later films.
Okay.
But one thing that you get from it that's really important is just the goofy sense of humor that the four of them have.
Right,
And I think,
wit, the dry wit.
Right. That's something that I absolutely cannot overestimate the impact of that on their fan base, because this was really one of the first bands that, the youth could get behind from that perspective, because they were more relatable.
It was rebellious.
Right. Everyone pined over Elvis, but Elvis was just one guy and he seemed untouchable. The Beatles seemed like guys you could hang out with.
Right.
And there were four of them and they were all on the same level as each other. You see interviews and press conferences from back in those days and they're just cracking jokes the whole time. They had charisma. They had a perfect balance of being casual and charismatic, as well as being professional at the same time and just kicking ass on stage. That's something, it's a presence that people hadn't really had before, and I think that bleeds into their films as well. People really felt like they got to know them. It wasn't like Elvis films back then where it was just kind of, they all felt like old school chick flicks to me, The Beatles were funny, and they capitalized on that. They incorporated it into their films, but then their music was still as serious as ever. And I think that A Hard Day's Night marks a dramatic shift in their sound, much more so than the change between Please Please Me and With the Beatles.
Well, I think their songwriting took a major step forward on this record, and more importantly, this song has no covers on it. All songs on this record were written by the Lennon-McCartney songwriting duo, and that is a very important thing, because it also makes A Hard Day's Night the first and probably most well-rounded Beatles record in their discography, just from the standpoint that it's all original content. You have many songs on this record that are just truly brilliant, that people will note as their go-to early Beatles songs. Examples of that are the title track and first track on the record, A Hard Day's Night. If I Fell in Love with You, and it goes. Can't Buy Me Love is on this record, and there's several other tracks that people all the time are coming back to and noting as like some of the Beatles' best work.
And there's a couple other changes I want to point out. They're really starting to improve and vary their songwriting approach. You mentioned Hard Day's Night, the title track, the opening track, definitely a standout. They have that classic opening chord, and then it ends with this just kind of arpeggiated guitar line that just kind of fades out.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day, I feel alright. I feel alright.
Those seem like little things, but they make a big difference. Another track I want to call out is If I Fell. From a songwriting standpoint, the beginning of that song, and I'll play a clip of it here in a moment, but the If I Fell in Love with You section, you'll notice that first, it's only like the first 15 seconds of the song, they never come back to it.
Right.
It's a short song, but they're already completely avoiding some of those just classic pop structures. Now, of course, they're doing it other places on the album, but that's how good of songwriters they were. That's how smooth they were, is they could have this section that is one of the most memorable spots on the album, and they never revisit it. They don't need to. They got other songs to do, other things to accomplish.
If I fell in love with you, would you promise to be true and help me understand? 'Cause I've been in love before, and I found that love was more than just holding hands. If I give my...
This is also where I think we start to see them blossom as songwriters for ballads. I feel like on their first couple albums, maybe it's just that they were afraid to really strip things down, but things never really got below like a 4 or 5 on the dynamic scale.
Very true. It was all built around that energy.
Right. And you could have tracks like, A Taste of Honey or something like, that. For some reason, that's the first one that comes to mind, that are slower, more sultry, more ballad-esque. But here with And I Love Her is the first track that, to me, in their discography, really brings it down to like a 2 or a 3.
Sure.
Just they really quiet it down, and that provides more dynamic contrast and just makes the album experience all the better.
I give her all my love, that's all I do. And if you saw my love, you'd love her too. I love her.
Yeah, they were starting to think about the album listening experience, which is just something they're dabbling in at this point. You know, the previous two records were not meant to be album listening experiences at all. They're just compilations of just whatever tracks the Beatles had in their catalog.
Mm-hmm.
And keep in mind, that's the other thing you have to think about is in these days and all the touring that they were doing, they had an arsenal of these songs, these go-to songs that they could just like guitar ready, pick up the guitar and play them. And you know, they were starting to use these songs in albums, and that's why you see a lot of covers in the early Beatles. And then they start to run out of covers later on, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But like on A Hard Day's Night, having this be all original content, you know, it was just such a monumental turn for the band.
It was a power play too. Like I mean, you know, they showed their label, they showed their fans that they could make an incredible album, all of original material. One other track I want to call out is the track Things We Said Today. I think that song is brilliant, and it's another example of the evolution of their songwriting. The contrast between the more kind of like, I don't want to say creepy, but it's a little bit darker in the verse, and then it moves into just the more driving chorus, but they make it flow so perfectly.
When we're dreaming, deep in love, not a lot to say, then we will remember things we said today. Me, I'm just the lucky kind. Love to hear you say that love is love.
Do you notice any production differences between With the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night?
Not as much production difference as I notice performance differences. I feel like they're falling more into the interplay between the band members even more. I think they know exactly when to take a step back and when to give others in the band the limelight.
Much more tactful.
Right, much more tactful, but I also just think their vocals were getting stronger. I mean, I would say even like in Things We Said Today as an example, you listen to Paul's vocals between the verse and chorus, and man, he just owns it. He knows exactly how to present each of those different ideas.
And the harmonies are becoming even stronger.
Yeah.
What about lyrically, Tom? Are we seeing an evolution in the lyrics here? Now, we noted on With the Beatles that Harrison's contribution did, you know, start to shift that teeny bopper, juvenile, fall in love lyrics towards something a little bit more cynical and self-loathing. But here, I'm still seeing, you know, if you just look at the song titles and think about the lyrics, you're still hearing a lot of that.
It's still a lot of relationship stuff. And there's another single that I want to point out that came out actually, you know, a little bit before this, which was She Loves You.
Yeah.
And that even was a lyrical evolution. While it doesn't seem like it, because it's still relationship-based, you know, Paul has said, you know, he mentioned kind of the reasoning for that was, well, we got all this stuff from me to you. It's always very second person, right? Like there's me, the singer, and then there's you, the person that I'm singing to and singing about. So with She Loves You, they bring in this kind of third person where it's saying she loves you. You're talking to a friend or something, you know? Like it's a subtle change, but it's there.
And then Pink Floyd runs with that, and they have us and then them.
Oh man,
and that's heavy.
So many pronouns. I can't even get through all of them, man. We need a song for every pronoun, every personal
They
pronoun.
might be giants. You're on it.
Right. But here, you know, we see just those minor variations. I don't think it's anything overly strong. You know, they're still singing about relationships, but I think that there's taking a step back, and instead of having it be more personal, you know, you see stuff like I'll Be Back, which, you know, once again, it still kind of covers similar ground, but it's from a slightly different perspective. The way that they're approaching these themes is just a little bit different, but it's not really drastic yet.
Now, moving on from their third record, A Hard Day's Night, we go to Beatles for Sale, which is their fourth album released in December of 1964. Now, before we jump into Beatles for Sale, there's a very important single that the Beatles released in November, so a month before Beatles for Sale actually came out, called I Feel Fine. And I Feel Fine is incredibly noteworthy because, and I'm not sure if this has been proven fact, but what has been talked about is that I Feel Fine is the first song put to recording, pressed to vinyl, in which you hear feedback. Intentional feedback. And that, as a production and songwriting device, is a very, very key step in the evolution of Beatles music.
baby's good to me, you know she's happy as can be, you know.
Some things that the Beatles are given credit for pioneering doesn't necessarily mean that they were the first people to do so, but you have to understand they had an audience, an engaged fan base that was absolutely unrivaled and unheard of by that point in time.
And after A Hard Day's Night, they had really reached the essence of Beatlemania.
Right.
It was huge. These guys would sell out, these huge concert venues, and the screaming would be so loud at their concerts that the band couldn't hear themselves play. They were sloppy. They were all over the place. And they were going on these just constant tours where they were playing, as Tom said earlier, multiple shows a day in different cities. And that was just an overwhelming experience, I'm sure.
From what I can tell, they were the first to put feedback on a recording intentionally. And that's a big move. Little things like that people are still doing today, and they kind of have the Beatles to give credit for. Not that they invented feedback, but they, it happened on accident, and they made a conscious decision to include it in a recording. And that decision is really what's key, especially when you're a pop band that has a strong following. You're pulling people along with you. You're opening the world up to these new ideas. And that, I think that we kind of all have to be thankful for. Plus, you have to acknowledge how incredible the guitar line in I Feel Fine is.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Just so good.
And it shows how they were evolving as musicians as well, both from a songwriting standpoint and just as a performance standpoint. Now, I think one of the most important things to note about their fourth record, Beatles for Sale, is, they went from A Hard Day's Night, a brilliant album full of all original content. They're now going back to their 6 covers on Beatles for Sale. The album isn't very long. It's about 33 minutes long, and the average track length is still between 2 and 2.5 minutes. So really not much change in like that generic album structure that all the way back from Please Please Me and With the Beatles. Now only a year has passed, but they're still following this basic formula for making a Beatles record, and they're going back to having 6 covers on the record now. So why did they do that? Why did they go from having a record full of all original content that was just a smash hit success, and then now Beatles for Sale, their 4th album, that has 6 covers on it again? The reason why is that these guys were touring so often, and the demand for their FaceTime and live performances was so huge at this point in time in 1964 that these guys had no time to write music. They were running out of songs in their just go-to arsenal of songs that they could just pull out of their catalog and just start playing.
And another thing too is while they were still writing songs, there wasn't as much of a quantity, but they were focusing more on quality. And one thing that I think also really set them apart is their very competitive nature. Around this time, between 1963 and 1964, not only were they constantly trying to one-up the other artists that were releasing songs, do it a little bit better than them, but they also were not willing to just do the same thing over and over again. Even if their early stuff sounds kind of similar, they were very competitive with themselves. They're like, we want to keep pushing our sound forward, and those were subtle changes in the beginning, and I think the reason they were so subtle is because the world just wasn't ready for a crazy left turn. They were still gaining a following. They were still getting people on board with the whole rock and roll thing. And so they were making these small changes, but it really set them up for even greater success later. Now with Beatles for Sale, I think that we're still seeing kind of a change, especially with the general tone. This album, I think, is a little bit darker.
It definitely
especially
is darker.
When you look at the first few tracks, No Reply, I'm a Loser, and Babies in Black. Taking a look at track 2, I'm a Loser, God, the song starts with the line, I'm a loser. John Lennon crooning that song. I mean, at the time he was anything but he was actually going through a bit of a depression through Beatles for Sale and the next album, Help. So that's kind of how he felt. Now he still ties it back into being about a relationship. He's a loser because he's lost a girl. Right. But I think that's once again an important variation and manipulation on the kind of overused trope of just relationships in songs.
Right.
And I'm not what I appear to be. Of all the love I have won or have lost, there is one love I should never have crossed.
while their songs are about relationships, it's about more of the negative aspects of relationships.
Yeah.
You're starting to see that evolution. Also, in addition to just their songwriting becoming more expansive, you're seeing a lot more complex instrumentation. Like track 5, All Follow the Sun, the guitar line in that is just absolutely incredible. And you see little pieces of color showing up throughout their songwriting, and it's starting to diversify the Beatles song. They're evolving. But because of the covers and because of tracks like the first track on side 2, which is probably in my top 10 favorite Beatles songs, 8 Days a Week, harkens back to their earliest days. I mean, 8 Days a Week could have been on with the Beatles.
Absolutely.
And it's just a go-to love song, but you're starting to see the lyrical evolution become a little bit more complex, a little bit more sinister, a little bit more dark. Just looking at the album cover of Beatles for Sale, these guys don't look as happy. They look kind of depressed. And
they do look kind of depressed in it. And the general tone, it's a good combination though. What they're doing is they're subtly blending their old sound with this new stuff, because they don't want to just throw all the new stuff at people. Right. They want to give them something that's familiar, because that's how you ease people into it. You turn up the temperature gradually, right? And that's what they're doing here. A couple other key things to note. This is where, to me, they really start to incorporate other kinds of instrumentals. You have that organ solo on Mr. Moonlight.
Mr. Moonlight.
These are some things that weren't as prevalent on earlier albums. And what's really important here, to me, noticing that is a key to understanding where they go in their later years, because in their early years, what they did was they weren't really changing their songwriting too drastically, but they were incorporating these other instrumentals to start to spice things up.
Right.
But once you start using those instrumentals in your albums, in your songwriting, you start to think of songwriting with those already in the back of your mind. So you start to write songs with those things in mind. And it subsequently changes the way that you write songs later.
Yes.
That's a really important switch that I think goes off more around Help and Rubber Soul, which we'll be getting to, but you start to see it on Beatles for Sale. Another thing, a couple tracks I want to highlight on here are, first off, their cover of Buddy Holly's Words of Love. That is one of my absolute favorite covers that the Beatles do. As I've said, I'm a huge Buddy Holly fan, and I think that the Beatles own that track. I think that they perform it really great. The harmonies are spot on.
Hold me close and tell me how you feel. Tell me love is real.
Also, the closing track, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. They have George singing that one. I love his performance on that, and I think it closes the album really well.
Took some honey from a tree, dressed it up and they called it me. Everybody's trying to be my baby. Everybody's trying to be my baby. Everybody's trying to be my baby now.
The covers on this record are actually part of why I love this record so much. This is my favorite record of early Beatles. And a lot of the reason for that is kind of hard to describe. It's the record where I felt like the Beatles really started to come into their own. The performances on this record are just absolutely perfected. And where their first 3 records, you hear them improve in each record. This, like Beatles for Sale, is the record where I really hear it all click and come together.
Yeah.
Even in the covers, despite the fact that they had to resort to including 6 covers on this album. The covers are exemplary covers.
Yeah.
The 2 that you mentioned, Tom, but also Rock and Roll Music. Lennon's performance on that is awesome. It's totally a fun track. Lots of energy. Kansas City, Hey Hey Hey, I think is just a brilliant track, and it's so simple yet it adds so much levity to this otherwise kind of dark album. So they're balancing the darkness of their original material with more upbeat covers.
Yeah.
And then also the swung cover that Ringo does lead vocals on side 2 of the record is Honey Don't.
Yeah.
And I absolutely love his performance there. It really shows a lot of color.
It's great. It fits very well because Ringo has this kind of like country drawl to his voice. And with a kind of swinging fun track like that, he's exactly the guy that needs to be singing it. It just wouldn't have been as good if any of the other 3 had sung that one.
Let me know, honey, how you feel. Tell the truth now, is love real? But
So Beatles for Sale, as their fourth record, under the circumstances that the Beatles, the band, and as humans were in at this point in time, like this could have been an absolute crap record. Their cards were really against this record, but the Beatles showed their artistry in the fact that they still turned out a fantastic performance on each individual track, and they tried to albumize this. You started to see a little bit of that here and there in A Hard Day's Night, and you're seeing them try to albumize Beatles for Sale a little bit more to be one cohesive listening experience, and you're going to see that go even further in their next records.
And in the next record, we have Help. We're moving on in 1965. We have another feature film by the Beatles. This time it's Help. This time it's in color. And the Help film is a lot different than Hard Day's Night. Whereas Hard Day's Night, they were going for more of kind of a mockumentary format. Help is, they're still themselves. They're still the Beatles. But the story is just absurd. Where Ringo has this like sacrificial ring, and there's this tribe of people trying to kill him or chop off his finger for it. It's completely ridiculous, but it's actually a really fun film. I really like it.
Now, another thing that we have to start talking about and thinking about and considering when we think about how the Beatles are evolving as a band is their use of drugs, which is not a topic that Tom and I talk about a lot because we have this fundamental belief and agreement that music should be great without you should be able to experience music and love it completely sober.
Yeah.
But inherently, if an artist is using drugs pretty heavily, it's going to affect their ability to write songs and how they approach writing songs, and that is absolutely true for the Beatles. Now, Tom, somewhere along in this time frame is when the Beatles first met the great artist of Bob Dylan.
Yep, August 1964.
Okay, so actually before Beatles for Sale came out, the Beatles and Bob Dylan introduced them to marijuana.
Right. But it was a slow thing for them because I think they were kind of afraid of it, kind of intimidated by it at first. But as they kept getting bigger, they were getting fueled by drugs. I got to say too, hate to use the phrase this way, it sounds kind of crude, but back in their Hamburg days, they were popping pills in order to stay up all night and performing. So it's not like they were, had never been exposed to the concept of drugs, but they were exposed to marijuana for the first time, and things kind of started to grow from there. So while they were introduced to marijuana before Beatles for Sale, I think that it really started to, influence their day-to-day life a little bit closer when you get to Help. During the making of the film, they admitted that during a lot of the scenes, they were just high as kites, had trouble completing the scenes without just breaking out into pot-induced giggles.
Yep.
And you do see that in the songwriting a little bit as well here. But actually, with the songs, it's not like these songs are just completely drug-addled or anything.
No,
but,
not at all.
But you start to see a lot of other influences come in on Help. And I will say, Help is actually my favorite album of their early days.
Right.
I love this record. I think that this is where you really start to see them blossom and growing a lot. It's the perfect stepping stone between the early days and like moving on to Rubber Soul and Revolver, where things just become drastically different. It's that exact center of the Venn diagram of those kinds of things.
And historically, the Beatles' discography has been divided into two sections, and we're going to be guilty of doing that as well in the early years and then the later years. But really, I kind of see it as three different sections. You have the first four records that we've talked about earlier, and then the middle Beatles albums of Help, Rubber Soul, and Revolver, and then all the later records that come from Sgt. Pepper on. And so I really don't consider this to be a true early Beatles record, and the reason is because you see the songwriting become so much more expansive on Help.
It's so much different, and they were really being influenced by Bob Dylan at this point musically, not just because he introduced them to marijuana, but because, you check out like You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. Very Dylan-esque track, but I will say this. It's funny, I never noticed that until someone pointed it out to me. I never would have called that out, but then once it was brought to my attention, I was like, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. This kind of, acoustic, folksy ballad. But the reason I think it's important to note that it might not be as noticeable offhand is because the Beatles take that style and they make it their own. They do something fresh with it. It doesn't just sound like they're doing a cover of Blowin' in the Wind by Bob Dylan. It's a completely different track. It's just inspired by. The way that the Beatles make it their own is first off with their classic production style. The production style, George Martin's production, is completely different than anything you would hear from the American folk tunes. not only that, but the lyrical themes. You've got To Hide Your Love Away. It's more that introspective relationship kind of thing rather than like a protest song or social commentary that you typically get from folk tunes. But then also they mix up the instrumentation a little bit with the general approach, with the flute solo that happens in that song. We're starting to see more instruments be incorporated. But there's also the minimalist percussion. Once again, they're starting to strip down their ballads a little bit more. But in general, just the performance, they make it a Beatles tune. I mean, it is a Beatles tune through and through. It's just that they're taking other influences, but not letting it completely change the way that they present their sound. I think that's really important.
I can see them laugh at me, and I hear them say, hey, you've got to hide your love away.
And there's 2 tracks on the back side of the record, side 2 of the record, that I really want to call out, and that's track 5 on side 2, which is I've Just Seen a Face. That track, it starts off with that guitar riff, that acoustic guitar riff that just gets stuck in your head. It is so addictive, and then they go into this like kind of upbeat but still melancholic jam,
kind of a country shuffle.
Yeah, and it's just such a unique sound.
I've just seen her face, I can't forget the time or place where we just met. She's just the girl for me, and I want all the world to see we've met. Had it been another
For anything that the Beatles had done to date, nothing sounds like I've Just Seen a Face. And then that song transitions to Yesterday, which Tom, you were just mentioning, and that song as the first like McCartney ballad of a long line of McCartney ballads that are gonna come out.
It's the penultimate Beatles ballad.
It really
probably
is.
one of the most ultimate ballads in general. One of the most covered songs. One of the most popular songs. Probably one of the best songs ever written. And this is where, too, when Paul wrote that song, he was kind of like, I don't really know what the other Beatles could do for this. And George Martin agreed, so they just had him record the guitar and sing it. It's important to note that Paul, as the bass player for the Beatles, actually was originally the guitarist, and when their old bass player Stu Sutcliffe left the band, someone had to do bass, and George and John were like, well, I'm not going to do it, so Paul happily took over.
Right.
But he could still write songs on guitar, and obviously Yesterday is an example of that, but they just put the string quartet with it and did it that way. And they wondered if, some folks around the group wondered if they should call it a Paul McCartney solo record. And they're like, no, it's still Beatles. It's still how we're doing it. They're actually, as a quick side note, there's a really interesting performance of this that they did. I don't recall offhand. I want to say maybe it was like Hong Kong or Tokyo, somewhere out east when they were touring, in 65 or maybe 66, where they play this song live and Paul does a bass part for it, and I think George is doing the guitar part and Ringo's playing drums too. So you even see that they were kind of reimagining their songs for the stage and doing like different variations.
Right. Well, at this point, touring had to have been getting old.
It was, and not only was it getting old, but it was getting difficult. They were writing songs that were becoming much more difficult to convey live.
Well, Yesterday, a lot of the time, didn't like the other members of the Beatles actually leave the stage when they performed that live and just let Paul play it on acoustic guitar?
Yep, that's how they did it when he performed it when they received the MBEs from the British Empire, that kind of honor. That's how they did it then, which I think it's kind of interesting that they had him perform that solo at all. When they only had a handful of songs to play, that they chose to do that one.
All my troubles seem so far away. Now it looks as though they're here to stay. Oh, I believe in yesterday. Suddenly.
But yeah, Help in general, you see them mixing up their sound a lot. Also, like Tell Me What You See is a good example of some varied instrumentation. They have the weirdo and claw bass in that, so more auxiliary percussion that they're bringing into the mix, along with just their songwriting it is getting more complicated
It definitely is more complex.
Dig into the actual chord structures. But here's the thing. The Beatles at this point were masters of making complex songs sound simple. It's the kind of trait that we would see, 20 some years later when bands like Pixies and Nirvana started to get popular. I would say the same thing about them. Those two bands make songs that are really complicated, but they pack so much into 2 or 3 minutes that you don't even notice.
Right.
And that's what the Beatles were doing. You could say their stuff was simple, but if you examine the chord structures, these guys, throughout their first 5 or 6 albums, were constantly challenging themselves to incorporate new chords, finding ways to make it smooth, and they were just doing it in a way that no one else really would. Another track I want to call out is Ticket to Ride, which, along with having some of that auxiliary percussion, kind of an interesting rhythmic approach, it also was their first single that was over 3 minutes long. Fun fact.
I wonder if they get royalties for every board game Ticket to Ride copy that's sold.
I don't know. Maybe they trademarked the name. Who knows?
Maybe. Yeah, you really do see their songwriting evolving, but also, vocal performances. The vocals here, with each Beatles record, the vocal performances get tighter and tighter, and especially in the harmonies. I mean, this record is just loaded with great harmonies.
And it's not only the performance, it's the production too. Mm-hmm. The production is starting to take a hard turn and really change things, because if you listen to their first 4 records, some of the traits there in the production is, the vocals are actually a lot lower in the mix, and they're very reverbed out. They just kind of blend with the instrumentals. With help, the vocals start to get a lot clearer, and they're produced in such a way that they're really sitting more on top of the mix. Even though the general recording practices weren't changing all that drastically, they're still having to do some more overdubs and things that they didn't used to have to do, and the way that George Martin is incorporating that into the sound is a lot different.
Right.
And then, once again, those production changes, they start to have in the back of their minds when they're writing the actual songs, and that's where we see big changes start to take place with their next couple records.
They're certainly flirting with playing with new lyrical themes on Help, but they're still, like, part of the song, some of the songs are still in that Beatles for sale mentality of being a bit more, still about relationships, but a bit more sardonic about the lyrical content, and so they're not quite ready. That everything about Help is it's this transitionary album between early Beatles and that middle era Beatles, and they're not quite ready to bust out of that formula just yet. This is still following the basic formula that the 4 records that came before this followed. Where you have 2 sides, the average track length is 2.5 minutes, but you are seeing some subtle changes in that really set up the next record of Rubber Soul.
Yep, and so Rubber Soul, we get to the end of 1965, December, where they're really trying to get stuff done for the Christmas rush.
Got to sell some albums.
Yeah, got to sell albums for Christmas, right? Because keep in mind, in the 60s, all this music stuff, even though while people were getting more creative and more expansive with sounds, it was still really a business industry. That's really what it was.
And who wouldn't want a brand new Beatles record for Christmas?
I still do. It sounds like a great Christmas gift. Anyway, so moving on to Rubber Soul. I mean, this album is a huge shift.
Huge shift in
First
sound.
Of all,
they refer to this as the Pot album.
Yeah.
And it's very noticeable. First of all, you look at the album cover, and these guys look stoned out of their minds. Their hair is a little bit more it's longer. They look like they're just dazing off. Even the title, the album title, is in that 60s.
Groovy.
It's that groovy swinger style, right? And so you see, you're just seeing an evolution in the band visually, an evolution in how they're approaching songwriting, an evolution of of their lyrical content. In fact, I would say Rubber Soul, if there was one change that absolutely dwarfs all the other changes, it has to be the change in their lyrical content.
Yeah.
And maybe this, like they say that the band has referred to this as the Pot album, and maybe this is because they're habitual pot users at this point, and that influences their creativity and what they want to write songs about. But I also think that outside of that, you have to keep in mind these guys have been doing the same formula of album for a couple years now. They've released 5 albums before this. They've toured extensively, thousands of shows, doing the same thing over and over again. These guys had grown up as musicians. They were starting to come into their own as both songwriters and as producers of their own music. So they were trying to, they had this need to experiment both in their lives, in their relationships, and in their music. And you're seeing that effect in Rubber Soul.
And this is where we're starting to see them write songs that are going to become more difficult to perform on stage.
Absolutely.
One in particular that they mention is Nowhere Man.
A real nowhere man sitting in his nowhere land, making all his nowhere plans for nobody.
The harmonies throughout this entire track, while these guys were no strangers to harmonies, Nowhere Man is a harmonically very complex song.
They were trying to push the envelope.
Right, they had trouble playing it live. So I think they were starting to see at this point that writing songs with live performance in mind was holding them back.
It was a limiting factor.
Yeah.
It was a constraint on their creativity.
And that in conjunction with, just getting more into the studio technique of things was a big change. So Rubber Soul, one noticeable difference in Paul's playing on the bass is he got a Rickenbacker bass he was using rather than the Hofner that he traditionally used on previous records. It had a bit of a thicker, more thunky sound. This is something that may not come as much of a difference to the casual listener, but any musician I think will agree with me when I say that getting a new instrument to play can completely change your approach to performance, completely change your approach to writing, and of course, naturally, it's going to have a different tone and sound too, so that can have an impact on the production. And I do think that, right away from the bass line in Drive My Car, which actually is the one that he didn't use the Rickenbacker for, but you can still tell that he's in a different mindset. And then on the rest of the record, it just thunks a bit more. But track 2, Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, is also where we see George bring in the sitar, using that heavily on that track as kind of a complement to John Lennon's acoustic guitar part. This album is also where we see the female characters that are the love interests in these songs start to develop more of a character.
Yeah, actual
more of a personality.
Yep.
Exactly. The girl in Norwegian Wood, that's a really interesting kind of slighted love story.
Once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me. She showed me her room, isn't it good? Norwegian Wood. She asked me to stay and she told me to.
Also, Michelle,
Yep.
Where you have the French girl. You also have the song "Girl," where it's the girl that'll kind of I don't know how to say it. Like she'll embarrass you around friends. She's a bit more coy. They're really actually making these. Rather than just being a pronoun, these women are actually becoming people in the songs. They're also starting to expand the lyricism outside of just relationships. Nowhere Man is obviously a completely introspective song that John wrote about himself. In My Life is another great example as well. More just singing about reflecting on past times and about life in general. They're starting to get deeper and more philosophical with these things.
There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed, some forever, not for better.
And what I love about Rubber Soul is that this really is a straight-through album listen. They have fully embraced the albumization concept at this point, and they've tried to develop one cohesive listening experience, and I think that they were very effective in that. The songs play off of one another, they build off of one another, the themes kind of transition throughout the record, and the record actually ends with a pretty dark song with Run For Your Life.
So this is, I want to point out real quick 2 highlights for me, which actually are George Harrison's tracks, Think For Yourself and If I Needed Someone. I think those are great, but I want to jump back to what you said, Jake, about Run For Your Life. So Rubber Soul in general, this is actually one of my least favorite Beatles albums. I will come out and say, I'm going to be a naysayer. I'm going to say I actually think this album's a little overrated. I think it was groundbreaking. It helped move the band forward. But I think that for me, actually, in opposition to what you said about it being a straight through listen, it still is. It's not like it's terrible. It's still better than 99% of music coming out today, I think. But in terms of the Beatles discography, there are a few tracks that don't really do quite as much for me. The Word, I'm kind of on. It's got kind of a cool instrumental groove, but it just doesn't really do a whole lot. And also Wait, I think is okay. That was a song that was left over from the Help sessions that they repurposed for Rubber Soul.
Right. But which is interesting because on the same day that Rubber Soul was released, they released 2 singles of Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out, which I think are exemplary tracks. And the fact that they did not include those on Rubber Soul, I think, first of all, would have made Rubber Soul a better album. I agree with you. Too. I agree with you in the fact that this is, not one of my favorite Beatles records, and that it is, I do believe, overrated.
I have to call out, though, the last track, Run For Your Life, that you mentioned, is, to me, by far the worst Beatles track that has ever been recorded. I hate that song.
Little Girl.
I hate. Yeah, it's another Little Girl one, but not only is it like it's not Little Girl Come Dance With Me, it's Little Girl I'm going to kill you.
I'm going to murder you
if I see you with another guy. The lyrics are terrible. They are inexcusably terrible, but not only that, even if you change the lyrics, it's just kind of a boring song. The melody is kind of droll. And ending this album, I can't consider this to be a perfect album when that song is the closing track. I hate that song.
I completely agree with you. While this album is definitely the album where they really embrace the albumization concept, its most notable weakness is track displacement and or disparity in quality. Songs like "Drive My Car" and Norwegian Wood. Can't say that for some reason. In Michelle, I love that song.
Yeah.
Completely set apart from some of the worst tracks on the album. Similarly, What Goes On, the Ringo Starr. The Ringo Starr song is kind of in that same vein as Run For Your Life, and I just don't like either of those tracks. I think the second half of this album is significantly weaker than the first half, and I still love this record, but it's just not one that I feel really deserves all of the acclaim that it gets. And a lot of times, this is people's go-to Beatles record.
True. It's up there, and I think this one is a landmark for its approach and its studio technique. I don't think that quality and that ambition is really complemented by the songwriting quality on this album. I will just come out and say that. I know that I'm in the minority in thinking that, but that's just how it is to me. However, those two approaches are things that I think they will perfect on some of the upcoming Beatles records, but we will get to that in our next podcast. So, Jake, are you ready to wrap up the early years?
I think so, TD.
All right. So to summarize the early years, which, was really just 3 years that we covered, 1963, 1964, 1965, I feel like what the Beatles really accomplished is they got everyone on board with what they were doing. And they did it slow. Well, they did it subtly, but actually very quickly when you think of it in terms of time. The changes that their albums went through in just a period of 3 years, was monumental, but they got such a large fan base. They got all these teenagers who were just discovering rock and roll music. This was a band that those kids could be on board with, and they were open-minded enough to stick with them through these changes. And to me, it's actually kind of one of the biggest tricks. It's almost like they duped everyone. Hi, you love us now, so now you're going to listen to all the crazy stuff that we're going to do in the late 60s, and it will open up your minds.
Well, they had reached an impasse, really.
Yeah.
They had made this musical product that was so commercially based, but it appealed to the type of person who was really interested in pop culture and the general consumer. But, maybe because of just the nature of their personalities, but, compounded by their relationships that they had built with artists like Bob Dylan and the other folks that they had met on their extensive tours, and they're beginning to use drugs habitually.
Yeah.
You're starting to see a craving for something of a more intellectual song. And the key thing about, and this has been said many times by many people, so this is nothing new, but the key thing about the Beatles' early works is it really appealed to multiple dimensions of fans, that more consumer-based fan, but also the more what we call hipsters today, the more intellectual-based fan who were looking for something deeper in the music. And the Beatles really catered to both. But after Rubber Soul really marked a change in the fact that they were starting to transition away from that consumeristic mindset, and shift more towards that intellectual mindset.
Because what you have to keep in mind is that while they were at this point kind of businessmen, they also just had a restless creative spirit, and they were not willing to sit in the same place for too long. So they wanted to do new things, and they knew that they had the support to do it. They had become powerful enough to essentially do whatever they wanted. They had the production mastermind of George Martin working with them, which I think is really key in this, because he was pioneering a lot of new studio techniques. He worked with them rather than trying to limit their creativity. He tried to keep up with it and actually exceed them in representing their ideas on tape. That was really key. So all these things I feel like really embody those early years of the Beatles, and we're just going to see it explode once we hit 1966 and on.
Another thing I want to point out, Tom, is, we kicked off this podcast, you were talking about the work ethic that the Beatles exemplified, and that being probably a direct reason why they became successful initially. That work ethic never really fell off, I don't think. And the proof is they released 6 albums in 3 years and had an extensive touring schedule, and had really taken their sound to as far as they could within that same generic formula that they had started with. But in addition to that, they had perfected their live show as best they could. In fact, to the point that they weren't really satisfied with it anymore, because they were touring so much, and Beatlemania had grown to a point that it was just so obtrusive to them to continue playing live, because they couldn't even hear themselves play.
Yeah, the fans actually kind of ruined it for him, because John Lennon at one point said, I feel like people are coming to see us, not to hear us. We're musicians. They took themselves seriously as musicians. They wanted people to be there for the music, but they couldn't even hear themselves. They knew the fans couldn't, so it's like, well, what's the point of doing this?
And right about this, at this Rubber Soul time, is when all of this really came to a head, and kind of force the Beatles to start thinking a little bit higher level about their direction and where they wanted to go. And history has written that they're going to move to be more experimental in their songwriting nature. So we definitely are seeing that on Rubber Soul, and we'll get to that in part 2 of the Beatles in the later years. So that wraps up part 1 of Velocities in Music's podcast devoted to deep diving into the Beatles' discography, the early years. Next week, we'll jump into the later years, and we'll provide some summary of how the Beatles finished off their career and our reflections on their entire discography. Thank you guys so much for your continued support and participation. Tom and I greatly appreciate all of your comments on our YouTube videos, Facebook messages, and our emails. Your participation is what makes Velocities in Music possible, so as always, thank you for being awesome. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.